Look, thanks everyone for coming along. It's a great pleasure to be here and to participate in this Victorian launch of John Blaxland's and Clare Birgin's very important new book, and to introduce the two authors to you, as I will in a moment. They'll each speak for 10 or 15 minutes after I've sat down, and then we'll open things up for questions. Revealing Secrets, an Unofficial History of Australian Signals Intelligence and the Advent of Cyber, is, as I say in my cover blurb, a really very meticulous compilation of the largely unsung past achievements of what I've always thought of as our most consistently productive intelligence source. Well, I have to say, with ASIS and ASIO, for both of whom I had ministerial responsibility during my time in government in the 80s and 90s, they didn't have a hell of a lot to beat in that respect. But the book is also a very thoughtful analysis of the extraordinary challenges to intelligence agencies which are now being posed by the new cyber universe. The book makes a number of contributions, both to our understanding of the past and our understanding of a series of issues which really, I think, need much more open debate than our own and allied governments have traditionally allowed or encouraged in this space. Those contributions. First, the book puts on record a great many of the previous unsung achievements of a little-known institution, which grew from a small backroom military office into a major government agency. Formally established, albeit without any official acknowledgement for a very long time, as the Defence Signals Bureau back in 1947, later renamed the more familiar Defence Signals Directorate, or DSD, and eventually, with its existence at last publicly acknowledged in the late 1990s, finally becoming the Australian Signals Directorate, or ASD, with its own statutory charter now, and with more recently still, actually a visible public outface with the Australian Centre for Cyber Security, or ACSC. But even after this evolution, despite a willingness by previous Director General Mike Burgess, not shared by his successor, Rachel Noble, willingness to reveal a great deal of the historical record, including some relatively recent offensive cyber operations like that against Daesh in Syria. Even after this evolution, the agency has maintained a quite deep reluctance to spell out publicly very much at all about what it does, about that record, including in the interwar and post and World War II years, and since then, Vietnam and beyond. It's a record which authors have compiled in great detail, especially for the pre-1945 years when they did have access to official records, and they'll no doubt want to tell you a little more about that record. Second contribution, the book puts on record the achievements, not just of the organisation they served, but some remarkable, but still barely known individuals, like the gifted electrical engineer, Florence Violet Mackenzie, who was an inspirational trainer of wartime women signallers, and the extraordinary Japanese linguist and codebreaker Eric Nave. And those stories haven't been really well told anywhere. They are told here, and you'll perhaps hear a little bit more about a couple of those things in a moment. Third contribution, the book provides, as you'd expect, a very clear account of the evolving complexity of the technological challenges that Sigint has had to address. Above all, in the shift from analogue use of the electromagnetic spectrum to digital use, with its accompanying deluge of new data. With that shift has come a whole new focus, not just on data collection, but the potentially offensive capabilities of cyber operations, and the need to develop new strategies for both attack and defence. Fourth contribution. The book really does contribute some important analysis and insights on the ethical challenges that are particularly associated with Sigint intelligence. The age-old question of how to balance the merits and virtues of actionable intelligence against the need for checks and balances on or against government excess. There are questions as to the extent, if at all, to which the extent to which, if at all, Sigint interception should be directed not just against Australian citizens, a familiar debate, but in some cases, foreign nationals. And that issue was thrown into very sharp relief, you may well recall, in 2013, when, as part of the massive Snowden leak of US NSA material, it was revealed that Australia had been listening in to the cell phone conversations of the Indonesian president, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, and his wife and their inner circle. It was a classic example, like the ASIS bugging of the East Timor cabinet room in the Cleary case, of what I've described as unintelligent intelligence. An intelligence agency mounting an operation just because it could, and insufficiently weighing the potential benefits of such an operation against the certainty of harm if the operation was ever revealed. I actually happened to be in Jakarta for a conference at the time and experienced firsthand, in conversation with my good friend Marty Natalegawa, then the foreign minister, the anger, the raw anger at the sense of betrayal that this was seen to evolve. The stupidity of that operation, for which the then coalition government refused to in any way apologise, as a result prolonging tensions for many months, although I had identified actually in my discussions with Marty and communicated to Canberra a form of words which Indonesia could accept, a form of apology words which Indonesia could accept and which I thought Australia could easily live with. The stupidity was that this was a hugely Australia-friendly government, from whom the kind of objectively accurate strategic outlook information that ASD was trying to collect, that was essentially available from high-level officials simply for the asking. That was the stupidity. Anyway, there's the ethical issues that are involved in using this intelligence methodology simply because one can. The fifth contribution the book makes, it's a very useful contribution to the ongoing necessary discussion as to what's the best legislative and governance structure for ASD in particular and the intelligence community in general. Although successive high-level reviews going all the way back to conducted by Justice Hope in the 1970s, about which Peter Edwards here tonight has written so brilliantly, although those high-level reviews have produced structures which are in many ways more transparent and more accountable in Australia than those in most of our comparable countries elsewhere, there are some questions and issues which do persist. In particular, especially since the folding of ONA, the Office of National Assessments, into the new ONI, newly created anyway, in particular is the issue of whether a sufficient division still exists between intelligence collection and intelligence analysis, which I certainly think that division should be very clear indeed. The sixth contribution the book makes is to expose very well the complexity of the issues involved in our Five Eyes relationship with the United States in particular, the pros and cons of Australia's investment in the very substantial intelligence infrastructure we now, at least notionally, share with the United States, above all at Pine Gap, near Alice Springs, at the Australian Defence Satellites Communications Centre, ADSCS at Codgerina, outside Geraldton, and the Sigint facility at Shoal Bay, just outside Darwin. While the authors do remain supportive of these arrangements and also supportive of the ties that are likely to bind to an even tighter extent if AUKUS lives up to its expectations, they aren't blind to the concerns that are felt by many, not least on my side of politics, that our national cost-benefit equation here might be just getting a teensy bit out of kilter. Finally, John and Claire's book demonstrates, by its very existence in print, after the less than subtle efforts to suppress it by the post-Burgess ASD leadership, of which I guess we might hear now a little bit more from John, it demonstrates that it is possible to stare down the more overbearing censorious instincts of the intelligence community. While there is still obviously plenty of truth in the old adage that the authors often quote, that in the intelligence business, the secret of success is keeping one's successes secret, while there's still plenty of sense, plenty of truth in that general proposition, there's also much to be said, not least in terms of the agency's own institutional interests, for having the community's understanding, the community's trust, and the community's confidence in the utility of what they are doing. And whether the ASD is comfortable acknowledging it or not, I think these interests are here admirably served by the two authors who will now address us. To introduce each of them in just a few words, less than each of them deserve, John Blaxland is Professor of International Security and Intelligence Studies in the SDSC, the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at ANU, with a long previous military career, including as a defence attaché in a couple of countries in Southeast Asia, and as Chief Intelligence Officer at Joint Operations Command headquarters at one stage. With a PhD in War Studies from the Royal Military College of Canada and an MA in History from ANU, John's a very distinguished historian with many published books to his credit, including 2 volumes of official ASIO history, which did actually win him the badge of honour of an enraged hostile review from Gerard Henderson. John's, of course, also a very prolific media commentator. Clare Birgin is a very distinguished former diplomat with a 30-year career in DFAT, with a focus on almost throughout her career on national security and intelligence, including as, well, ambassador to Hungary, then to Serbia and neighbouring countries, and then from 2004 to 10, in that period, and then before that, postings in Warsaw, in Moscow, where we first met back in the very heady days when the Soviet Union was disintegrating in 1991. So she's been in Moscow, she's been in Geneva, and she's been in Washington, DC as ONA liaison officer. She did a BA and Masters in International Law at ANU, was a visiting fellow there before joining John's history writing team. So over to you both, starting first with Clare. Clare Birgin.
Oh, well, I've been warned by my former foreign minister that I'm a low speaker. So if anybody can't hear me, please let me know. If am I audible at the moment? I've been told that the best way to cope if you're a low speaker is by picturing the audience naked. But I can't. I try to do that, but I can't do it. I can't quite manage. I wish first to thank the Honourable Gareth Evans, Distinguished Honorary Professor at the Australian National University, and also Foreign Minister Extraordinaire. It was wonderful during those years when he was Foreign Minister. The French didn't have a monopoly on ideas, that people were coming. As an Australian diplomat, it was really great. People would come to you and say, what is Australia thinking about whatever crisis? What does Australia think we should do about it? It was great. I'd also like to thank our publishers, the University of New South Wales Press, the wonderful bookshop, which is here tonight, and of course, the Institute of International Affairs of Victoria. And we're very happy to be in Melbourne for reasons which I'll go into in a moment. In the book, we quote a couple of times the traitor unmasked at the end of John le Carré's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, who says that the secret services are the only real measure of a nation's political health, the only real expression of its subconscious. And Alex Younger, the former head of MI6, said something similar in a speech in 2018. You can tell a lot about the soul of a country from its intelligence services. It's as if the silence and secrecy about Sigint, after all, it's the most secret part of intelligence, somehow preserves and intensifies certain qualities that we think of as being Australian, like a bit of diffidence, understatement of one's achievements, but resourcefulness, managing, if necessary, on the smell of an oil rag, and occasional larrikinism. There are many examples of it in Revealing Secrets. And because the setting for so much of Australia's signals intelligence history was Melbourne, there is a strong Melbourne feel to our Sigint history, and that history in turn has left an imprint here. Justice Robert Marsden Hope, who led the royal commissions that shaped the intelligence community of today, had a high opinion of what used to be called DSD, the Defence Signals Division, until 1977, which was then in Melbourne and is now ASD. In his 1977 report, he said that the constraints of specialisation and secrecy combined to develop in DSD a degree of exclusiveness and inward looking that could prove dangerous for morale. But that has not happened. On the contrary, the management had contrived to engender a strong feeling of esprit de corps based on these same constraints. I think Hope, because of the date, was talking about Ralph Thompson, born in North Carlton in 1917, who led what is now ASD from 1950 to 1977. But I've heard that Ian Mackenzie is very similar, so the tradition didn't die out with him. But the story of Australian Sigint, of course, began long before DSD. Our book, Revealing Secrets, actually goes right back to the very beginning, even briefly to the origins of all coded messages. Australian signals intelligence didn't suddenly appear from nowhere. I'll leave it to John to talk about how the book started as an official history and then became unofficial and something more. But before discussing that, let's take a quick signals intelligence tour d'horizon of Melbourne. Some of the Melbourne Sigint history is quite, I find, mysterious, which is not surprising. Of all Australian cities, I find Melbourne the most intriguing and actually romantic, like the scrawled note arranging a meeting between the eccentric but hard-headed Alistair Sanford, a major player in our Sigint history, and Brigadier General Spencer Aiken, MacArthur's chief signal officer at McRobertson's Girls' School. Do people know where that is? McRobertson's, yeah. On the 1st of April, 1942. And we have no record of that meeting, but it must have been important because Aiken would subsequently take command of the combined Allied organisation called Central Bureau, with Sanford as the Australian deputy. And not far away from us tonight either are the Monterey Flats in Queen's Road near Albert Park. These flats were the home of Fleet Radio Unit Melbourne, or FRUMEL, where the RAND Sigint organisation joined the US Navy's Sigint unit when it was evacuated from the Philippines in 1942. The Australian Army's Sigint organisation was the Australian Special Wireless Group, which established intercept stations. And one of the things they did, which I particularly liked, in July 1944, the Special Wireless Section, the 52nd Special Wireless Section of the ASWG at Bonegilla, intercepted one of the first reports of the attempted assassination of Hitler. Writing to the Foreign Ministry in Tokyo, the Japanese minister in Stockholm explained that an elite German army group known as the Adelklassen had planned a coup d'etat. When the Gestapo discovered them, they were forced to spring into action prematurely, and the plot unfortunately failed. Yeah. Now, soon after General Douglas MacArthur arrived in Melbourne, Central Bureau was established on the 15th of April 1942 in a large house which I think has been demolished, called Cranley, in Domain Road in South Yarra, before they moved to Brisbane in September. The Bureau was responsible for the cryptanalysis of both Japanese Army and Navy Air Force signals, because they didn't have a separate Air Force, with material collected by both the US Army and the Australian Special Wireless Group stations. And both the RAN and the Army began work on Japanese diplomatic communications before Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. In the case of the Navy, there was the Special Intelligence Bureau, as Gareth mentioned, run by the world famous codebreaker Eric Nave, who had actually been working for British Naval Intelligence, but was lent back to the Royal Australian Navy for this purpose. As for the Army, in 1940, the military intelligence staff at Eastern Command in Paddington, Sydney, formed a small group of mathematicians and classicists at Sydney University to practice code breaking on Japanese consular traffic. In early 1940, a diplomatic and press section was formed in Melbourne with an intercept station at Park Orchards that was maintained by the Army's 5th Special Wireless Section. In mid-1941, several members of the Sydney University group were posted to Nave's Special Intelligence Bureau in Melbourne. And when Frummel began operations, the Special Intelligence Bureau joined it in the Monterey building. There then ensued a most brutal and unequal bureaucratic struggle, in which the protagonists were an aggressive American officer, Rudolph Fabian, and Australia's Eric Nave. Not only the illustrious career of Nave, but Australia's independent cryptanalytic capability, which I call the jewel in the crown, were at stake. Under the Holden Agreement of the 2nd of October 1942, which followed between the United States and Britain, Australia was not even consulted. The British not only recalled Nave to Britain, but turned over his special cryptological unit to the Americans. I'm pleased to say that the Australians won in the end through tenacity and cleverness. After very skillful lobbying by Alistair Sanford, whom I mentioned earlier, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Little, the Deputy DMI, and Lieutenant General Smart, Australia's senior military representative in London, the Admiralty agreed to Nave's extended loan actually to the Australian Army in exchange for the return of 2 Foreign Office staff attached to the Special Intelligence Bureau and a visit by Sanford to confer with Britain's Government Code and Cipher School. This 1943 visit of 4 weeks in London was a real coup. It established a cryptographic channel between the Australian Army and GC&CS, independent of the United States, which lasted until the end of the Pacific War. Sanford and Little worked together to preserve as much of the cryptological core or crown jewels of Nave's unit as possible, and it survived as the nucleus of Australian Sigint of today. Nave's diplomatic group was transferred from the RAN control to the Army, moving to the 2nd floor of A Block in Victoria Barracks, again not far away from us. We're right in the middle of it. And it was renamed D Special Section. From January 1942, the section was headed by Professor Arthur Dale Trendall, Professor of Greek and Archaeology at Sydney University. My mother was one of his students. He was an expert in 4th century BC Greek vases. Trendall's gifts really lent themselves to code breaking. He considered the intuitive approach far superior to the mathematical, but even he couldn't explain to anyone how he broke codes. He described his own experience years later as, oh, you get a feeling for it, your eye lights upon something and bang. So among the members of the elite diplomatic section of this cryptographic organisation were Dr. Elizabeth Shepherd, Mavis Tilley, a Japanese linguist from Melbourne University. The linguists also included an Arthur Cooper from British forces in Singapore. Cooper was evacuated by ship and submarine together with his pet gibbon Tertius and arrived at Monterey in March 1942. The gibbon was given back to the Melbourne Zoo when Cooper returned to the United Kingdom. But Trendall later made some comments about Cooper, which reveal as much about Trendall and his brain as they do about Cooper and his brain. And Trendall also seems to have had in mind Tertius in his brain, but see what you think. He said there was a really good linguist for intelligence purposes, he was very much at the top of the tree, a very fine brain. So Australia's direction finding and intercept stations, cryptography, and particularly traffic analysis, where Australians were the best, better than anybody else, were vital to the Allied signals intelligence effort. Of the thousands of Australians involved in Sigint in wartime, there remained a very small group in D Special Section in Melbourne who could break into enemy diplomatic communications and inform decisions of the War Cabinet. This was the jewel in the crown and the nucleus for the Australian Sigint of today. But as Gareth was saying, impressive as this was and is, the pressure to stay ahead of the game is still on. The United States still has the edge in quantum computing, but the Chinese are working to build quantum computers so powerful that they will easily crack today's encryption. Revealing Secrets also discusses ASD's Red Spice program, which began in March 2022, not only before the Albanese government won the elections, but before a new strategy for cyber security was announced in December 2022. And some people have speculated that our cyber strategy has already changed to become more like that of the United States, i.e. persistent engagement. There has been and still is a lot of public debate about this persistent engagement in the United States. Those who like it say that enemy cyber attacks can only be countered by operating in their space. But the critics of this approach say that the risks of accidents and escalation are unacceptably high. I haven't heard this kind of debate here. But we were asked recently, John and I were asked recently, whether we thought the Five Eyes arrangement is as important as it once was. We still see the Five Eyes as unique and invaluable, but maybe once again, Hope was right, as he so often was, when he said, we also need constantly to reassess the benefits to Australia from intelligence relationships with other countries against the costs. However, let us return very briefly to the human element in Revealing Secrets. Have I got time? Yep. In 1938, Mrs. Florence Violet Mackenzie, whom you mentioned, Gareth, showed more foresight about the future demand for signallers than the Naval Board. As an electrical engineer, she opened a school to train girls in Morse and radio. So as a result, there were women signallers in all three services, and they were high performers. The Garage Girls, who you might have seen in Andrew Probyn's recent ABC TV documentary, Breaking the Code, were among them. And a number would serve at intercept sites as well, like Bonegilla. But really, the young men and women of Australia's signals intelligence enterprise today are the direct professional descendants of these remarkable people. Writing Revealing Secrets has been great fun. Thank you to John Blaxland, and thank you all for coming tonight.
Thanks very much, Claire. And I'd like to also acknowledge Gareth's great contribution as my former Chancellor, also the Jeju Peace Prize Award recipient. Recently, I was very happy to be there in Korea with him for that great event. The architect of the Cambodian Peace Accord. We are honoured to have Gareth here tonight chairing this event. I'm just tickle pink, so thank you, Gareth. Also acknowledge Peter Edwards, the official historian who wrote about Justice Hope, amongst many other things. Peter, lovely to see you here as well. Thank you. I also acknowledge the former director of DSD, Ian Mackenzie, who's here. Thank you for coming in. It's a great honour that you're here as well. Thank you also to Alastair for making this possible, and UNSW Press and the bookshop who's come along. Thank you very much. I want to just briefly talk about some aspects of the story, which just flesh out a little bit of what you've heard. I know you've heard some great aspects, so you obviously already can converts, I'm preaching to the choir, I'm sure. But there's some really interesting things about ancient cryptology, which I think are important for us, for the layperson, to get an understanding of what signals intelligence and cryptology is all about. And that's why we go right back in time. to reach back and to explain monoalphabetic and polyalphabetic substitution, where you get a letter or a set of letters and you literally transpose them across a few letters. So you confuse the reader and you make it difficult for them at first value to try and read it. And that gives you some protection. Now, the person reading it may take a little while to work it out, and that length of time might be just enough that you need. Okay. But of course, over time, things got more and more complicated and machines started getting introduced. The concept of the wheel was an ancient one that was used for that polyalphabetic substitution. But of course, it becomes part of the Enigma machine and the purple machine of the Second World War. And this idea of machine-generated codes was designed to go beyond what the human brain could cope with, right? And that was supposed to be so good that the Allies couldn't possibly break it, except they could through ingenuity. And it was what Gareth was talking about, that not just the arithmetic capability, but the artistic capability, the skill, the ability to actually weave together the combination of clever science and that je ne sais quoi, that hunch. What is that opening phrase? What could it possibly be? Well, it's probably something predictable, a greeting of some kind. And when you put those kind of patterns in, you could then unpick the code. And that was what was often done to actually give the leads to the people with these electromechanical computers early on, the bombs, as they call them, to actually start the process of unraveling the code. It was exciting work, nail-biting work. It didn't always work out properly, but in the end, it was transformational, and it gave the Allies an incredible edge in the Second World War. Interestingly, for Australia, the Second World War experience wasn't so great. We started out with a bunch of, geeky nerds who were either ancient historians or mathematicians, or sometimes a bit of both. Ath Traweek being one, for instance, from Sydney University. He comes down to Melbourne to join the team at Victoria Barracks, who starts out by reading the Edward Snowden of the 1930s, Herbert V. Yardley's The American Black Chamber. Herbert Yardley, he is, absolutely persona non grata in the intelligence circles, because what he does is he explains how he's sacked by the US Secretary of State under Hoover, whose name is escaping me right now. Is it Stimson? Yeah, Stimson, who says, gentlemen don't read each other's mail, right? So he closes down the US Sigint agency, and Yardley is ropeable. He's absolutely ropeable. So he said, I'm going to get back at you, Stimson. I'm going to write a book about it. And so he reveals in this book about American cryptology in the First World War, and also in the Anglo-Japanese treaty negotiations and the Washington Treaty negotiations of 1921. And when this is translated into Japanese, they're absolutely ropeable that the Americans would do this act of perfidy, right? Of course, this is the thing, in the espionage business, as Gareth was saying, you do really want to keep your successes secret. You don't want to divulge too much because it gives them game away. And of course, machine-generated codes worked, being able to unravel the German and the Japanese codes worked because they hadn't cottoned on to what the Soviets had. And the Soviets had cottoned on to the vulnerabilities of machine-generated codes in the 1930s. Why? Because of politicians in the British Parliament who boasted about how good they were at breaking the Soviet codes, right? So the Soviets picked up on this and they thought, oh, well, that's no good. So they figured out the only way of safely communicating was one-time pads. And so throughout, we have this really interesting story. And of course, people may have heard about Venona. David Horner wrote about it in the first volume of the ASIO history. What the blazes is that? Well, it is this a set of one-time pads that were duplicated. And they were done when the Germans, the Nazis, were on the borders, on the outskirts of Moscow. They were running out of one-time pads. So they made a set of duplicates. And that duplicate, they used them through to 1948, when we know that one of the traitors actually made sure that the Soviets found out and that they stopped using them. But in that window from 41 to 48, there was this gold mine of where you could actually compare these two sets of codes. There's only one set of comparison, but it was devilishly difficult to actually do that comparison and unpick the code. And that's what led to the idea, the revelation of the nests of spies in Australia, which leads to the generation of ASIO, and then, of course, the reinvigoration subsequently of the signals arrangements in Australia. Very exciting for us, Claire and I, working on this to piece this story together and explain the significance of Australia's participation. Now, Claire and Gareth have talked about this, particularly in relation to the Second World War, these range of bodies that are kind of got these funny names: Central Bureau, Fleet Radio Unit, Melbourne, Section 22. What the blazes is that? Well, of course, it's a radar, electronic intelligence section, right? The D special section, D standing for diplomatic, right? Reading the diplomatic codes, which is a big no-no back then, right? And of course, the work of the Australian Special Wireless Group, because why were we listening into the German, the diplomatic traffic from Sweden to Japan? Because of the ionosphere, the bouncing of the radio waves, the HF radio waves that could be picked up in Bonagilla. Just amazing. And this is, so we have a special role. You couldn't do that in the UK. You couldn't do it in the US. You could only do it here because that's how the ionosphere worked. So we made a significant contribution then that led to, in the post-war years, a recognition that Australia had a role to play for Britain as it sought to recapture its empire, and for the United States as it wanted to play in East Asia. And that's demonstrated in the wars of Korea, in Vietnam, and of course, we talk about this briefly, and on Afghanistan and Iraq. What is interesting also, I think, is the work of Justice Hope and the governance, and Gareth touched on this. I think this is one of the things we can really be really proud of in Australia, that we have really, relatively speaking, remarkably robust intelligence oversight mechanisms. With the Inspector General of Intelligence and Security, the Intelligence and National Security Legislation Monitor, and now the NAC as well, but a series of mechanisms that actually hold to account and constrain the abuse of power that is inherent in these secretive bodies like ASD. And of course, what we have is, as you all know, and in fact, I was talking to Dean Oakley, an old friend back there, who I know from when I was he was the previous satellite terminal troop commander to me at Watsonia when we did the downlink to DSD as it was then, and he was the first person to brief me in on signals intelligence. And I remember coming out, I said, I wasn't allowed to write anything down. I said, what just happened to me? And Dean said, oh, you might want to read this book by Des Ball, right? Little did I realise how prominently Des Ball would feature subsequently in my academic career, but a great colleague. So the Copernican revolution of the fourth industrial revolution, the digital revolution, transforms this body that, starts out called Defence Signals Bureau. What the blazes is that? It's not Telstra, right? It's a secretive body that's actually eavesdropping, but it was hiding behind that name. And of course, when the digital revolution comes along, then we all of a sudden, the computing excellence and the brain power that's in DSD and ASD that is doing all this thinking about ones and zeros and going from electromechanical to digital is groundbreaking. It's the heart of the cyber industry in Australia. Cyber security, Mike Burgess, why does he go to Telstra from 5 years from DSD? Because he's an expert in cyber and computing. He goes there to help Telstra work it out and protect this critical infrastructure for Australia. And so we see this body that's full of geeky nerds, hoodie-wearing, basement-dwelling people, who actually now have a front shop role for the nation as cybersecurity advisors. So it's an incredible Copernican transformation of this body that retains its Sigint function, but adopts this new one for the fourth industrial revolution that is actually arguably critical to the future of the nation. So it's been a lot of fun. A final point about the unofficial nature. Maybe I would leave that for the Q&A. Somebody can ask me about it. Do it? Okay. So we were commissioned by Mike Burgess to write an official history, a 2-volume history, and that seemed fine, but there was a clause in there that with the standard defence contract, they could cancel at will. Well, I thought, well, I'm pretty confident I can deliver, and Mike was just pretty confident he wants to have it happen. But I didn't realise he was going to go and move to be the director of ASIO, and his successor was not as enthusiastic, and initially chopped 25 years off the project. And I thought, oh, that's a shame. That's probably the most relevant and contemporarily, consequential part of the story. And I thought, it's your call. It's not my project. I'll do what I'm told to a point. But then they wanted to change it further and take away what we had with the ASIO contract, which was that ASIO had the rights as part of the deal to edit out anything of any operational sensitivity. No problem. But we had editorial rights to actually say what we thought as judgments. And that was the key point. So they could, and we had to take out bits. And about from the ASIO history and the volumes I wrote, about 92% was retained. So only 8% chopped. So it's pretty good, I felt, because we were able to tell the story and pixelate out bits that were sensitive, that had operational implications. I was confident we could do that. But essentially, I wasn't given that right. The director wanted to have complete editorial control. And I said, look, I'm at the ANU. I can't do that. So that's not how we work. And it's not good for you for that to happen anyway. But so on that, it's very interesting. I worked for the late Brendan Sigint, who took over from me as head of the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre. And he had warned me. He said, John, when he found out Rachel got the job, he said, hurry up, John. You won't have long. And he was right. I thought, no, she'll be right. She'll be good. We'll be good. Wasn't. But anyway, the good thing was that as they wanted the money back, and Brian Schmidt, to his credit, said, look, we'll pay you back what John hasn't spent, on the proviso that you give him the IP to what was drafted up to 1945. We'd written up to 1960, but it was rough and patchy, and it was just too much bother. So he said, give us to 45. So we did that, and then I was pretty gutted, but Claire is a legend. Such a great colleague, such a great co-author. She picked me up and said, John, pull yourself together, man. There's a story here to finish. And sure enough, she basically got drafting on the last 3 chapters. And then she motivated me to buy back in on the project. And the rest is history. Thanks very much.
You haven't told us how, you haven't told us how, why it was that ANU Press chickened out and why you had to go to UNSW.
There's a little bit of a kind of mixed messages. I don't quite know how that story got to be reported that way. I actually thought we were going to go with Alan and Unwin, who did the ASIO history, but they locked in a deal when the deal was with ASD, not with me, not with ANU. And then David Horner basically said, John, go with UNSW. They're really good. And so that's how it worked out. It wasn't a matter of ANU being wimpish. No. That was a slightly, no, it was not a fair representation. Yeah, great.
Open to questions. Questions from the floor or from our online audience as well. So, yes. Over there.
A little bit. Fits in with the ASD. How does ASIO fit in with ASD?
ASIO?
Yeah.
ASIO doesn't fit in with ANU.
That's yeah.
ASD.
How does the signals work with ASIO?
Well, ANU, John can explain. There is a cyber training facility there that ANU is working on. It's public knowledge, training the next generation of cyber analysts and experts. And I mean, that's a bit sensitive. And John, say a bit more about that.
So there's a couple of things to note there. One is that ASIO works to a different department, so it's organisationally very separate. It works to the Attorney General for warrants and to the Department of the Minister for Home Affairs on financial matters. But they're both part of the National Intelligence Community, so they work coordinated by the Director General National Intelligence. So there's an overlap there. But what's happened is that now with the digital revolution, ASIO, this is one of the reasons why Mike Burgess went across to ASIO from ASD. ASIO is the old analog days of security intelligence past. Now it's analog and digital. And ASIO needed to go through its own revolution, and Mike Burgess was the handmaiden of that transformation. So that's probably what I could say there.
Can you tell us about the ANU training centre?
So we have a collab arrangement. That's a deal whereby we educate and train some of ASD's cyber experts with the College of Computing and Engineering and Computer Science. So that's a collaborative deal, collaborative arrangement. And I sometimes even get invited to speak to that, surprisingly enough.
That's not a secret operation at all. It's just technical skills that are being. Okay, more questions. Yeah, right back.
Hi, I'm Masa. My question was, how do you think that, I guess, the revelation of the public, revealing secrets, how will it change public's perception of intelligence services and the practices? And also a side question, has there been any mention in the book about the ethical implications of intelligence work?
No, that's a very good question, and it's something that we have been focusing on a lot, because obviously intelligence in any society like ours, any democracy, has to be the first line of defense now, especially in the current cyber environment. But for that to work properly, the public has to have confidence in it. And that's where John's comments about oversight are so important, that you need transparency and accountability, but without risking people's lives and giving away sources and methods. So that's really, I guess, what we're talking about, what Gareth is talking about as well. It's a fine line between giving people the justified confidence that you're telling them as much as you can about what's going on, but without using secrecy as an exertion of power, because it can be used for, for to give you bureaucratic leverage or something. I mean, theoretically, it could be, if it was badly used. Does that answer your question? I think also, I mean, that's what I was trying to get out a bit with the red spice. I don't think we've caught up in our public debate on what we're spending all that money on. That's millions and millions of dollars for the first time that ASD has got.
I might just add a point about statecraft. One of the things we hope to achieve with the book is help Australians understand how intelligence is part of statecraft. It's not a very well understood part because it's not been written about very much, because it's been so secretive for so long. But when we think about how we engage with the world, intelligence is part of it, and signals intelligence is at the core of that. It's about understanding the world we live in and informing policy choices. And this is what Gareth was saying in his opening remarks about how the utility of that in formulation of policy responses. That's really important. But there's some great examples. One of them is in the Second World War. I meant to mention it, where Monty and Rommel, these two generals who are pitted against each other. Rommel is considered the legend, who's got this uncanny ability to do what they call, he had this Fingerspitzengefühl. It's my favorite German word. The uncanny ability to know exactly where to put his finger, right? And every time it flummoxed the Brits. But what it was he was listening in, because the Germans had broken the American codes. And there was this very conscientious American diplomat in Cairo who was writing back in detail back to Washington about what the British plans for the next phase of operations was. So Rommel was getting a blow-by-blow heads up on what the Brits were going to do next. So a series of British generals unfortunately for them, were held at, their careers ended basically because Rommel had this advantage. Then the 9th Division captured the German EW signals unit, and we then figured out about the American listening into the codes. So all of a sudden the tide was turned, and Monty comes onto the scene, who is a competent general, but he doesn't have that flair. But because he's got Sigint, he all of a sudden gets a huge leg up.
Jean McLean.
Thank you.
There's a mic.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask, and thank you very much for your description of the book. It sounds very exciting, and I think to buy it. But one of the things that worries me is that we aren't told anything. We, the public, are told lies. All this machinery works very cleverly, iron gap in the run, gold whistling, etc. But the Vietnam War, all the wars we've been involved in, Iraq, Afghanistan, gunning down people, whatever, we're lied to. We're not told UNOFficial and, submarines costing hundreds of millions, and let's all go and support it because otherwise China might come and gobble us up or whatever. But Australians, the public is not told anything about what the hell we're doing as Asians, etc. So can you tell me how we can maybe jump to a situation where not only you can find out what the baddies are doing outside and watching the...
Okay, John, you do say a fair bit in the book about what is happening at Pine Gap and Cocharina and elsewhere. Would you like to put whatever you can on the record in response to Jean? Absolutely.
No, thanks for the comments, Jean. The point I'd make is that, and picking up on Gareth has said, we do try and explain the functions, and we try and actually, what we're hoping is the book will actually stimulate a greater understanding, a more aware public engagement on the issues, and that as a result, we can actually have more of an informed discussion, and that we won't just be, going with the standard line. One of the interesting things, Claire and I have talked about this, practitioners don't say anything because they don't know that they're allowed to say anything, because they only know what they know from having a classified briefing, right? And the book hopefully is going to some way to give people a sense of the space where you can actually talk about this in an informed way without giving away national secrets, without going to jail for breaching secrecy of provisions, but actually helping us as a nation consider in an informed way the pros and cons of the options for the future. And of course, as you're pointing out, Jean, the future is, we don't know what it looks like, but and intelligence doesn't actually give you the answers, but it helps you make informed decisions. And so helping us as a nation understand that is, I think, really important. And I think the book is what we hope that the book will contribute. Thanks.
Thanks, John. Maria, look at Image.
Thank you. We live in a
Here's the...
Oh, thank you. Maria Jockle. We live in an incredibly disruptive and turbulent world. And I appreciate that you would like the public to be informed as best as possible, but these are very dangerous times. You've made some comments about your reservations about the alliances that we've made so far. We're a vast nation with an absolutely tiny population, totally defenseless and unable to defend ourselves. So against that background, what do? We have to have multilateral, bilateral and other relationships. But let's say hypothetically we were to be attacked by a mighty military power. Where would we be if we did not have those alliances, however compromised they may be? What is your answer to that question?
Slightly bigger subject than just intelligence, but John, would you like to offer a first line response?
Yeah, I think we're not saying we shouldn't have.
Speak up a bit.
We're not saying that we shouldn't have the alliances, but in fact, I think we say that they have been very important. But what we are saying, we are sort of invoking what Justice Hope said, and saying that we have to actually look at them on their merits all the time and not just assume, but that because this has worked in the past, it's always going to work, and certain other countries are always going to share their intelligence with us. I mean, the whole history of the world involves change. So we don't want to, we need to keep up with it. It's not saying that we need to drop certain alliances, but one of the points that actually John made in the book, which I think was particularly good, is that you know, the eternal paradox about Australia's history and its geography, you know, how there's this tension. It's spelt out more clearly, more obviously in the most secret area of our intelligence, i.e. Sigint, than anywhere else, that we're with these 5 countries, which actually differentiates us to a certain extent from Asia. So we just need to keep an eye on those things. I think that's more what we're saying.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, I mean, there's lots to be said on this topic. I mean, obviously no country can afford to be defenceless against possible contingencies, including of an existential kind. But it is realistic to ask ourselves how existential are the risks we face in terms of actual invasion, as distinct from just buggery with sea lanes and trade. It is reasonable to ask ourselves how much sovereign agency we're sacrificing if the ties that bind get ever more inextricably tight. And it is reasonable, I think, to ask ourselves just how much insurance we're actually buying as we get sucked ever further into these technical arrangements. It's been a long, long story, the intelligence community relationship, the Five Eyes relationship, and so the AUKUS is really only adding another layer to that, but it is a legitimate subject of debate, which I don't think the present government is very interested in having, but it's one that we should certainly have as a civil society.
So
but it's a huge topic, and I know Ian McKenzie would like to ask a question, and we want him to ask it because he's a former Director General. So, John, do you want to say me something more there?
Well, I was just going to add that there's another dialectic other than the history and geography, and that's the fear of abandonment and the fear of entrapment. Yeah. And this is the fine balance that we as a nation have tried to manage in terms of our commitments in alliance relationships to get the most benefit for Australia without going down the gurgler effectively by overcommitting. But over to Ian.
It's a debate we're going to go on having, including at Dyson House and its successors. Ian.
I'm conscious of time. I noticed it's signals intelligence history, but AST is both an information security and signals intelligence agency. And that's a unique feature of the accuser agencies, that they all have both offence and defence in their organisations. I know of only one other country in the world that does the same thing, a small Western European country, and they only did it 15 years ago. Sweden. Japanese, South Koreans, Singaporeans, all of Western Europe, none of them do it, but we do. And I used to say to some people, sometimes running an organisation like this is like you're the coach of 2 basketball teams playing each other, because defence informs offence and offence informs defence. And that's not just true in cyber, it's true way back in the war in the Atlantic, where the biggest benefit was changing the Allied codes, not Enigma.
Any last words from either of you in response to that or otherwise?
I think Ian's final words are apt.
Sorry?
I think Ian's final words are apt. Yeah.
There we go. Back to you, Alistair, to wrap up.
Okay, well, so we are out of time, I'm afraid. Very sorry for that, but thank you, John, Claire, Gareth, so much for your time, for the book. Thank you all for coming. There's books here to be bought and signed, so please stick around, come and have a chat. I think we've got about 20 minutes or so before we have to get these fine people off to another appointment. But thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for a great session, and please buy the book.
Thank you.